Hello, welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's a great pleasure to welcome to today's program, Chris Jones, who's Executive Vice President of Industry and Services at Descartes. And today we're going to talk about the labor shortage problem, why it's bigger than you think, and how to address it. So in a survey we conducted with our Indago supply chain research community back in October 2021, we asked our members, which parts of the physical supply chain are the most broken or need the most fixing. And not surprising, especially at the time, ocean ports ranked number one, but a close second was labor. And, simply put, the demand for labor across all parts of the supply chain are far exceeding, supply, available workers out there. So is this, is the COVID pandemic the main reason, for this problem, or are there other factors at play? What are the implications for shippers, carriers, logistics service providers, and others across the industry? And how can technology help alleviate, this problem? Well, those are going to be some of the main questions we're going to address in today's episode. And it's great to have Chris on the program to share his insights and perspective on this topic. So Chris, welcome to the program.
Great. Thanks, Adrian. Appreciate being here. And this is really a bigger subject than, as you're saying, than probably most people really understand.
Yeah, no, I absolutely, in many ways. So first of all, Happy New Year. This is our first episode of 2022. To quote the great Yogi Berra, it seems like deja vu all over again. Pandemic, the pandemic is still with us and still, navigating through those challenges. And certainly, like I mentioned in my opening remarks, aside from ocean shipping, finding labor is, one of the biggest supply chain issues many companies are facing. But I think, I know in some initial discussions we had, I think people might have a very limited perspective of how big of a problem, this is and what all the factors are. And certainly the COVID pandemic has certainly exacerbated the problem. But, is it the main cause of the problem, or are there other factors at play?
Well, that's a great question. I guess I would use the term the pandemic has masked the problem that exists out there. I just, over the last couple of months, have been doing some research in this space, and there's things that people know. The pandemic is basically did put a lot of people on the sideline, but when you really start looking at it, and of course, there was also supplemental income, and that was really thought by a lot of folks to also by itself just delay people from coming back into the workforce. But it's really deeper than that. So maybe I'm going to run through a bunch of numbers because I think they're pretty compelling and they kind of paint the bigger story here. So the first one is that the jobs recovery has actually been incredible. The December numbers just came out. To your point, we're just into the new year here. They were down at 3.9%. The month before was at 4.2%. The pre-pandemic number, which was 3.5%, so that was February of 2020, so literally right before it all fell on us, right? That was the lowest rate non-wartime number. All right, so that's a phenomenal number, 3.5%. But it only, in this last decline, of 0.3%, we only generated 200,000 new jobs. So we're at a point now where we're getting almost asymptotic to where the value is, right, and what's happening right here. So that's really kind of one of the big pieces. Something else that probably is pretty well known by most people is the pandemic did accelerate boomers retaring. A whole bunch of reasons, everything from didn't want to deal with the fallout of the pandemic, and healthcare concerns and so forth, to making a fair amount of money during the pandemic, right? So they left the workforce and they're not coming back, right? What's also interesting about this, and just again, looking at numbers here, is job openings, right? Pre-pandemic, so again, right before it, there were 7 million job openings. And as of last fall, like last September, there were 10 million, right? So there's just a whole lot of demand for people. And, it's not just supply chain. You walk down the street, you see stores and restaurants and you name it, everybody's looking for people, right? So what's also really tough is particularly in areas like supply chain where you can require a lot of labor, is that the shortage is actually even worse. So for, let's say, lower skilled roles, there's actually more college level people that are out there than there are for those kinds of roles. Let's call them more knowledge worker roles than there are for the roles that normally would be typical labor. So all kinds of stuff. All right. So this is what everybody has probably mostly seen go on. So, but in reality, what's happened is this started a long time ago. So I have more numbers for people here, and this is where it gets a little crazy, and why this is so significant and will be. So the first one is, you take a country like Japan. Pre-pandemic, I was traveling internationally quite a bit. Been going to Japan for 30 years, and I can tell you that that's been a known thing, that their population is declining. I don't know if people know how much, but between 1995 and 2050, their population will go down, working age people, 34%. That is just absolutely huge. And you go there and many people are working into their late 60s, 70s, and 80s even. So that's a challenge. China's another one. Again, numbers that just came out. 2021 was the worst percentage of population growth since 1949. So essentially since the communist revolution. They had a one-child policy for a long time because they were concerned about growth. 2016, they went to a two-child policy. Last year, they went to a three-child policy. So it's a big deal, and it's global. And one thing I would like to do is give credit to a presentation that I saw called the Demographic Drought, and Adrian has seen it. And something we're glad to share the URL to watch it because it's really eye-opening. But you really have to look at replacement rate for births, and this is a big deal. And this is why this is so structural in nature. So replacement rate is 2.1. So you got to have 2.1 kids per family. And unfortunately, as people don't all make it right to the point of having kids to be able to replace. All right. US hasn't hit that number in 50 years. All right. Today it's at 1.7. All right. 2020 was the worst year in history. This is not great stuff in terms of growth. The working I'll call it pre or younger folks working age is in terms of them coming up is less than 22 people. It's as low as it's been. It's been declining for 20 years. And college enrollment, if you hadn't heard about this one, because it's been a big issue for a while, it's down 11% since 2011. So we don't have labor. We don't have as many educated people as we want. All right. And then, so let me just give a couple quick more facts, and I'll stop here, because this is not just a US problem. All right. So I mentioned that US is at 1.7 in terms of its replacement birth rate. Korea is at 0.6. Italy is at 1. And most of the Western world is somewhere around where we are, or maybe even slightly worse. And the probably even more shocking part of it is Latin America is just dropped below the replacement rate. So that was something I don't think anybody would guess off the top of their head. And India is approaching it. So they're still above, but they're getting close to it. So it's a big deal. The last point I'd make then is, in the US, forever, we solved this problem through immigration. For this whole 50 years, the majority of it, we've been, we're a history of immigrants. So, but that's really how it's happened. It's not just this administration, the previous administration, and the one before that. You can go through all of them. It's been declining in terms of our ability to promote that. So 2020 was really the worst, and we haven't recovered yet.
A lot of fascinating data there, and like you said, I'll share that URL as well in terms of that presentation that you referenced. But it was very eye-opening, and I think my key takeaway, as you just kind of summarized there, is this is a global problem. It's not just a U.S. problem. It's been happening for some time, so it's not just the pandemic that kind of brought this to the surface. I mean, this has been decades. In the making. And I like, I kind of said the pandemic exacerbated, but I like your term or your perspective better. I think it has masked, the problem, in some ways. And you're right. I mean, I know that, over the past year, just looking at LinkedIn, I saw so many folks that are of the, let's say the baby boomer generation that were announcing, their retirements, right? So I definitely saw that with the folks that I follow and on LinkedIn, and certainly saw an uptick, in that. And I think even the birth rate, I think a lot of folks were thinking that maybe that was, we would see a spike in 2020, right? The whole, hey, everyone's at home, they've got nothing to do, there might be opportunities there for people to, have more kids. And, that didn't happen. If anything, it went in the opposite, direction. So I think, it's been a long-term trends that have been impacting this, and the outlook moving forward is not very positive either. So then the question is, Chris, I mean, what does this mean for, shippers and logistics service providers and carriers and everyone that needs, that needs workers? I mean, what actions or changes do they need to make, to address this problem, effectively, not only kind of in the short term here, as we're talking about this right now, but, in the years ahead, because, the long-term projections aren't positive either.
Right. Well, funny, Adrian, I just say also in the whole thing around the pandemic and will we have more births? I thought it would be a combination of more births and more divorces. So, but seriously, there's really, there's a number of things to think about here. So let's just talk kind of strategy. One is people need to rethink their whole approach to recruiting, hiring, and retention. All right, both blue and white collar workers. Biggest thing is focus on churn and reducing churn. That is the first thing that people really need to get after. And unfortunately, in the logistics space, particularly when you look at drivers and warehouse workers, you have very, very high churn rates. And so if you're constantly in this mode of having to replenish, that's a huge problem, let alone, and so many businesses are going through growth at this point in time. They're looking for more people than they have, right? So keeping the ones you have is really, really important. Second quick piece on this one is flexibility in how you're recruiting. Okay, so even for highly skilled positions, because you may find and we'll go through this a little bit more in detail, but that you need to move people around, all right, as things are going on. So if you hire somebody who's really, really good at X and they can really only do X, and when X is not as important for you, what are you going to do, right? So the goal is to be able to move people, and we'll talk about that. Another one is alternate sources of workers, right? So, this is social integration of offenders, right? So simply put, people out of jail, people with disabilities. There's a lot of great programs around that. And in the supply chain space, people not typically associated with it. And so there's a lot more conversation around things like women drivers, right? So there's a lot of things that could be done there outside of the traditional space, right? Third thing is, and it really fits into all of this, which is training programs. So many companies have abandoned training. And I can tell you, and I started a long time ago, when I started out of college, I went to a company that had very big on training and internal development of people. That company had totally abandoned that. And they're not like so many others. I mean, in the sense of it's happened. Right. So now you really need to look at this and target, high schools and community colleges and new college grads. And it's also part of keeping them is skills development and career development programs. People want to do different things. They want to get better at what they do and all this stuff. And we really need to invest in that level. The fourth one, and this is one going to be, I think, really, really important strategy is I call it an evergreen productivity program, which is, and this is different than just efficiency. Productivity is about getting more out of the people you have. A lot of times when people talk about efficiency, they're thinking about like being more effective and getting rid of people. Here, it's going to be about, what if I got one more stop per route from my drivers, or I was able to ship, 30 more orders, right? All this kind of stuff. This has to be ongoing, and we really have to get rid of manual and repetitive knowledge-based activities and allow people to focus more on value-added services. And quite frankly, for the ones who are more on the execution side of it, to allow them to be able to do more work, right? Equally, when we're doing that, though, we need to make sure that we are not creating more stress on that organization, because that gets in back to that whole notion of losing people, right? Along that same lines is the whole notion of flexing. A lot of companies, especially peak season, have relied on hiring massive amounts of people. Holidays is a typical one, right? What are you going to do when there's not a lot of people out there to go get that are excess in the workforce? There will always be some, but your ability to scale, we've seen companies do this, particularly in the e-commerce space, literally not add any people and double their capacity over the peak season by changing their strategies and so forth, and much smarter directed work and things like that, right? Some of the more, significant ones are, I hate to say this for people and companies that are truly global, is you need to look at where you have your operations, right? Are you producing something in really declining population countries? That's going to be a challenge. And this kind of thing, you're not going to change like tomorrow, but it's a 5-year, maybe even longer activity. You got to start now, because there's just going to be more and more pressure on people in those areas, and particularly if you're seeing growth using the products that are produced there somewhere else, right? I think maybe two more that are out there is, one is, I'll call it changing the ROI equation. And so, like I mentioned, productivity is a good example, but instead of, you should get value for freeing up and redeploying resources, not just automating and eliminating them, right? Because you're going to need these extra bodies. You're going to have to find ways to, I'll call it, manufacture them. Some of it's going to be hiring, but a lot of it's going to be redeployment. And then the last one is rethink immigration. This one, unfortunately, has too many political overtones with it, but the numbers are really there. We need to find ways to be able to get skills at all levels into this country to support the businesses that are there.
Yeah, a great list of ideas and potential actions there, and I think it's one of these, all of the above, types of things that companies need to, be exploring. I mean, going back to the training piece, same with me. When I started my career, I started at Motorola, and at the time, Motorola had Motorola University, and every employee had to take 40 hours of ongoing training, and they had a huge catalog. It was really like a university. It had a huge course catalog, and you can take anything from, I was an engineer, so you could take very engineering specific classes, but you can take things like, effective presentations, or, effective listening, or, other, types of classes. And I think that did create, some level of stickiness, if you will, because you were continuously upgrading your skills and learning new things, and it was a great benefit that I think a lot of employees appreciated there. Same thing with the cross training that you brought up. I think is going to become highly important. And then finally, eliminating some of this waste and inefficiency that's out there, that's creating need for more labor, because there's still a lot of manual processes there. And certainly that's an area in transportation and logistics where there continues to be a lot of waste and inefficiency, which kind of brings me to the next question, because that then is where kind of the realm of technology comes in. So, I mean, do you see this labor shortage problem serving as a catalyst for, continued investments in technology, and how can technology help alleviate this problem?
Definitely see the investments going up. Actually, we do a couple of benchmark surveys. One of the ones we just did in the forwarder broker space, it's not published yet, but literally I just went through the numbers last week, and it's one of the top issues, and using technology as a way to get it was the top approach. And so, again, there's a couple of places where I think people need to think about in a broad way what they're going to do. So one of them is obviously this whole notion of people replacement and augmentation, and robotics is known as one of those, particularly in the warehouse space, but it can easily go beyond that. And I think that's one that people need to get after. Hard automation has been out there forever. Literally, I started my career doing that kind of stuff. Soft automation is really where I think the opportunities are, as I mentioned, things like directing labor. Okay, you still have people, you didn't replace them, but they're way more productive because you look at how to be able to, get them focused on things that are more higher value and take away from, that take away from their time and so forth. So that's a big one. Really, this whole notion of focusing on higher value activity. I'll give you a good example. Robotic process automation to me is a great way. It gets back into the whole notion of soft automation. But I think the twists are combining it with other things like optimization technology. I mean, and this gets into this whole notion. It's not just about blue collar jobs. It's about white collar and knowledge worker jobs. And why does a company have, for instance, 50 people to plan all their delivery routes across North America? We've seen it where people have taken it down to literally 5. All right. And what they've done is they've automated the planning process. They have their people focus on exceptions. It pretty much runs lights out. Right. Again, not getting rid of those 45 people, but putting them in, having them do other things that you need to do in the company. That's the big change. AI and machine learning, a lot of hype around that. I think a lot of great opportunity there, particularly on the machine learning side of it. Being able to, again, I think of this as a white collar level thing, being able to identify trends, be able to spot issues, all this kind of stuff, exception-based work, right? Which typically would have been a knowledge worker activity. A lot of those could happen that way, right? Another one is putting your customer to work for you, right? So digitization of customer-facing systems. I mean, this has been out there forever. It's amazed at how many people don't get what the airline industry did, basically, and all of us love it. We can book online, we can do everything we want to do. We do it all for them, right? The same thing here. And in the logistics space, this is just starting. And I know a lot of logistics people not be happy with me saying this, but I know this personally because my wife happens to be one of these people, a shipper who does not want to talk to the sales guy about getting a quote, right? Wants it right now, doesn't want it in 5 days, and so forth. They want to do all this in a self-service fashion, right? So again, free up your people for things that are really high value. And by the way, your customers like this stuff too, okay? Another one is optimization itself for productivity and resource retention. So one, we talked about this before, getting more, like, this whole more, deliveries per route, consolidated shipments, you name it, all kinds of great stuff. Other thing about this, though, is you can actually use optimization to do a better job of balancing work across your workforce. And we've had customers talk to us about how they keep their drivers because they're less stressed. The routes, for instance, they're running as an example for deliveries are much more feasible. They're not having all this chaos that they would have had before. And by the way, every day is a lot more consistent day. And as they work, across their workforce, right, they're able to balance work better. So, counterintuitive to where people think about these things. Scaling technology. This is one we were talking about a little bit earlier in terms of peak periods. How do you basically get the people you have to do, not for maybe sustained levels, all year, but parts of the year where you've changed your strategies and you're literally running 2-3 times the shipments with the same amount of folks. Or when you bring people in, they're instantly, highly valuable, right? This is another one. And then the last one, really, as I mentioned before, about like some things you're going to need to do are more structural in nature, like moving facilities or looking at, other kinds of, call it supply chain strategies. It's really 2 things. It's global trade intelligence and supply chain design. And you need to be able to look at some new supply sources. And that's, by the way, with labor too, right? And how trade lanes are developing. Where can I move goods based on how things are happening? And I'll give you an example. Vietnam's a really good one in terms of things like furniture moving to Vietnam out of China. China still produces the majority, but Vietnam is becoming a player because people have now recognized that and they realize that there is capacity there at some level, right? And the last one, obviously, is this repositioning. It's like, where should you put things? If you do look at where your candidates are, you do need to design your supply chain to manage those flows. And now maybe part of that process is, hey, what's the resource base going to be for the, when you make these investments these days, they're 10 to 20 years, right? So.
Yeah, no, great points there. I mean, I like that last one. I mean, I think, kind of paying more attention to labor availability as part of the supply chain network design. I like, I think a lot of folks immediately gravitate when they think about technology, they think about kind of these robots in the warehouses, which have been going on for some time, right? But I like that you brought up kind of the soft automation aspect to it as well, whether it's RPAs or just the use of optimization, the combination of these things, I think, has a compounding benefit effect, on all of this. And I love the self-service aspect of it. Absolutely. I mean, I think the airline example is a great one where, hey, there might be things that customers or some of the other trading partners may want to do themselves to kind of take the load off of your labor requirement. And in fact, it's actually a benefit because it's to their, they prefer to do it themselves than have you do it on their behalf. So a lot of great, insights there. Well, Chris, I mean, we're running out of time here. So just as a way to kind of wrap up, I mean, do you see then, labor becoming a competitive differentiator for companies moving forward? That is, we talk a lot about companies competing on customer experience, but, are they also going to start competing on their ability to attract, hire, and retain workers?
I do. And here's the why. And this is maybe we go back to the pandemic, which is the pandemic, changed so much, and companies that were innovative, probably even starting before the pandemic, but really in it, they're the ones that have been thriving, tremendously. And innovation is all about people. You got to have talent, right? And so that's definitely the white collar component of it. So, like I mentioned, all these programs and stuff you want to get in place, to be able to be the employer of choice, right? We talk about, shipper of choice. Well, how about employer of choice, right? And the same thing on the blue collar side of it. The same things will apply there. Maybe they're motivated a little bit differently, but they're still motivated. And so things you can do to make them productive, but not create highly stressful situations and so forth. Or what are the things you're going to do to keep these people? And the keep is going to be as important as hire.
Yeah. Again, great points there. And I think we often talk about, how the way we've always done things are not going to work anymore. And I think this is a prime example of the way companies have historically managed labor, thought about labor, and the whole hiring, retaining, so forth. They need to look at it now through this different lens and understand these long-term trends and how they're going to continue to project, moving forward, and, adapt accordingly to, because this is, I agree, it is going to become a competitive differentiator as well. Well, Chris, we covered a lot of ground. You provided some great data and insights, and a lot of, it's a very meaty topic that I'm sure that, we'll probably want to circle back at some point down the road and maybe get an update on some of this data and see how companies are addressing, this labor shortage problem. But you provided some great, great ideas for companies to get started on this journey. So again, thank you for making the time to be with us today.
Well, thank you, Adrian. It's like you said, it's a great topic, and it's time for people to take a serious look at it differently than we have for, unfortunately, maybe decades.
Absolutely. And I want to thank those of you that joined us today. If you're watching this episode on demand, either at the Descartes website or on Talking Logistics, and you've got a question or a comment for Chris, you can post it there, and I'm sure he'll be more than happy to respond via that medium. Again, thank you for joining us, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.